Okay, we are good to go.
Super. Anybody want to MC this thing? It's just gives me a little break if I don't have to both read the questions and answer them. So if anybody wants to volunteer for that, that'd be helpful too. Come on. I know none of you are that shy. Or maybe a few of you are, but there's plenty in this room that aren't shy.
Multitasking. I'm at work, so I gotta.
Oh yeah, well that's true. That's a good point. I'm sure some of you are
I'd be glad to help.
Okay, thanks, Valerie.
You're welcome.
Well, go ahead.
So, would you like to start off with reading a question first, and then we'll go to someone asking a question?
That would be fine. We have a pretty good stack in the Jeff did it that way last time, and let's try that again. So I see I made a little room for questions, and then there's also the chat room. So let's see what we can do. So
okay. Well, Freedom is Real asked, I would be keen to hear PBK's Paul's view on the change that was brought on to the role of the pastor by the rise of clinical psychology.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when I was in seminary, clinical psychology had already pretty significantly colonized pastoral care to the degree that our pastoral care professors kept trying to hammer it into our minds that we are not clinical psychologists, so let's not play psychologist from the pulpit. What was, I think, less clear to seminarians and possibly to the professors was where the lines are between psychology and religion. Religion is just such a broad, powerful, how do you even describe it, area that, psychology and sociology have to some degree become, well, let me back up a little bit. So let's go back to Jordan Peterson's, what do people see? People see meaning, people see opportunity and threats. Well, the power and opportunity of science was so vividly demonstrated that no other field could resist it. So biblical studies became a science. Human relationships became a science in psychology and sociology. And the goal was, in a sense, to be able to, the most difficult thing to colonize are human beings because we're the most complex. And so we found that science was incredibly powerful in colonizing the material world. We could draw minerals out of the ground and create iron and bronze and steel, and we continue to perfect and fine-tune all of these things. And so, of course, the desire was, well, why can't we use this power to address things that are either unwanted or unhealthy is its own fraught word, or evil. And so the power of science applied to the dynamics of human personality and relationship was simply too tempting a target for most pastors to back away from. And so in a lot of ways, ever since the development of psychology and sociology, pastors have been dabbling in it because in some ways their old tools, which were seen as religious tools, which weren't uniquely religious tools, were seemed to be less effective than these new powerful tools. And so pastors It's very common for someone to grow up religious and very quickly, well, pastoring used to be a high status vocation. So young, ambitious, smart individuals would go into the ministry and they would be using all the tools of the church such that they were given such as learning to exegete the Bible and preach and pastoral care. But the fields were so murky that they were most often taught by watching. So you learn pastoral care by being pastored, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly the psychologists come around and, well, they're showing some, you go to therapy often with, and okay, so what's the metric that the therapist is using to see if their treatment is effective? Unless it's something very specifically behavioral, it's, are you feeling better? Wow. Well, is that scientific? Well, sort of, but also hardly. And pastors, of course, had been doing exactly the same thing, but pastors had other frames and frameworks and grids with which to measure things on, moral grids, communal grids. So the two fields got tremendously intertwined. And so it's very common to have pastors sort of mid-career throw up their hands and become clinical psychologists, because as Andrew Root, I think, laid out nicely, what's the point? Because all of these pastor tools just seemed completely irrelevant. And so this larger conversation about that Jordan Peterson really stepped into and ignited has everything to do with, well, what do pastors do? Well, pastors are gardeners, cultivators of worldview and story and narrative. And this narrative, unlike what Sam Harris tried to say in his conversations with Jordan Peterson, well, this narrative these are powerful ways to embody facts. Oh, and Jordan Peterson just basically comes along and says, yeah, but your facts are all nested in story. You've got the order wrong here. And so then when we bring in some Wilfrid Sellers, the scientific image is, for human beings, the scientific image is always nested in the manifest image, which is exactly why we can never achieve the clean room of a monarchical vision by which to see the world. Now, in many ways, psychology and sociology indulge in that monarchical vision in ways that the older craft of pastoral care and theology and pastoral leadership don't really let you get away with. That's why I said, so you've got like stories of old. This guy's using story to undo story. Well, if the tool you're using, if the tool you're using to deconstruct is what you have faith in, you're never going to finally arrive, because you're not going to deconstruct your own tool, which is exactly what we see in some of this critical theory. So what I think we're seeing now as modernity weakens is that the over-promising and under-delivering of psychology and sociology is increasingly exposed, which puts us back into the much less, the area which is far more difficult to colonize via science. And that's why I think we are going to see, and I think have been seeing in pastoral literature, much more of a, I mean, even look now, the language, pastoral care is kind of having a comeback. Spiritual direction. It's why we see these things go back and forth. But as modernity and a scientific worldview wanes, as we are increasingly aware of the fact that the scientific image is nested within the manifest image, we're going to see a revival of these more ancient forms because they're simply broader and more durable than and more economical than the scientific forms. I don't know if that was helpful for anyone.
That was pretty good. Thank you very much. We're going to go to the group and see if anyone has any questions, and then I'll read another one after that. Anybody have any thoughts or questions?
I have a question. I am having trouble with God 1 and God 2.
I know you've talked about it before, but can you kind of go over your view of critical theory and kind of how it's playing into current events and what your reaction is to it?
Well,
Okay. I think we had two people there. Sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
I think Agent 16. I'm not sure who came in first. God 1 and God 2 came in first, I think, before critical theory.
Yeah, I just have trouble with that concept. I've been really trying to work that through. I know it's been covered lots, but...
Well, so it gets into the question of what do we mean by this word God? And so, part of what I've been thinking a lot about lately is how we use words and how difficult words are. So when we use a word like God, that word works or has power or is effective to the degree that the people around you have some sort of shared understanding of what that word means. Now, here's a lot happened 500 years ago, and that's what Charles Taylor, a lot has been happening in the last 500 years that is very interesting in terms of humanity. It's not always unique, but it certainly is significant. So there are various evidential items that fold into this for me. The problem of evil as a source of religious skepticism. When I say the problem of evil, we think of it in a certain way today. Now, the ancients had a very similar thing, and you can read about it in the book of Job. Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible. But what's different in terms of the impact of the problem of evil today? And I think that has everything to do with what happened with the rise of scientific thinking and deism, which are deeply connected in that the world is in some deep way mechanical. Now, an ancient person, when trouble struck, had certain assumptions about their capacity. One of which was, you're probably not going to be able to do anything. And so, the Odyssey, Homer's great tale, is in some ways a story about Odysseus who wrestles with the gods because he's got some gods on his side, he's got some gods against him, and he's one way or another, by hook or by crook, he's going to try and get what he wants. Now, he is embedded in a worldview like Kaufman talks about. There's a metadivine realm, which is functionally, the line between person and non-person is very blurry and has been forever, probably. And this is all what we're into thinking about. But an ancient person simply assumed that the universe is full of persons and personification, and that human beings are very small and weak. and that the house always wins and the deck is stacked against you. And so in some ways, that dominates their approach to the problem of evil. Job cries out, but when God shows up and says, really? Job backs down because Job understands. I think our success in colonizing what we call the natural order has deeply impacted our impression of our capacity to the degree that, okay, now here are all the different elements of God number one and God number two. John Vervaeke talks about the agent and the agent arena relationship, that we're nested within this arena, which is mechanistic, predictable, reliable, and agents within it have this power to colonize. In that sense, if you talk about my group A and group B, group A are colonizable things, group B are colonizers. The arena is very colonizable, and the agent is a colonizer. God number one is the aspect of our environment which seems colonizable. And God number two is the aspect of our arena that is agentic in our experience with it. Now, if you read the Bible, if you read almost anything written 500 years ago, even certain reformed documents such as the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgian Confession, which I was reared on, they have items like the providence of God, and they say things like God brings fat years and lean years. Okay? Now, I remember having a woman start coming to my church who was Pentecostal. And she said, God brings no bad thing into my life. And I think, have you read the Bible? And it's all throughout the Bible. God, an ancient person understood that God has an arenic aspect to that conception. And Paul, in harmony with some poets, says, in him we live and move and have our being. The whole idea of being in Christ has a very arenic aspect to it. That's God number one. And ancient people, when they said the word God, completely assumed that. Well, as deism progresses, that the arena is increasingly seen as mechanistic and colonizable. And God, which always had both aspects to it, God increasingly is less arenic and more agentic. And so that comes to full demonstration when the conflict between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Because at the end of Vancouver 1, they haven't arrived at Sam Harris's goal. Jordan Peterson's goal is Jordan Peterson wants Sam Harris to fully appreciate the work of Kant and the degree to which we have an a priori framework through which we see the world, which has in many ways been the dominant work of cognitive science. What is this mesh? What is this filter? Okay. And what Jordan Peterson recognized with his long journey and his journey into mythology and symbolism and all of that is that, well, what is God? And then look at the list that Jordan Peterson reads in that video. And I listened to that and I thought, yeah, reading the ancients, they would recognize that as God. Sam Harris doesn't. Sam Harris says, no. And he has this claptrap about the word ghost, which, no. you're not understanding Jordan. You haven't understood Jordan the whole night. And if you did, you're not speaking in good faith, which I don't think so. I think he's just not listening. And then Sam has, no, this is a God who, doesn't want you to masturbate. And Brett is sort of in between. Brett, I think, is understanding Jordan and Brett listens to Jordan and says, oh, I get that. I can understand that. Because, of course, in some ways, Brett's whole project has been making an arenic reality of blind Darwinian evolution agentic to the degree that Brett Weinstein has these two tracks of the genetic and the cultural. And so it stands to reason that Brett is already meshing these two things, God number one and God number two, in a way that Sam can't see, but Jordan very clearly sees. And so the God number one is the arenic in terms of, again, the arena agent relationship. God number one is the arenic aspect of God. And again, what we mean by God is, and I don't want to say panentheism, because there's other things attached to that. I just made Luke's day, if and when he hears this.
And Jacob's day.
Jacob's day. And this is what Kaufman notes. Kaufman notes that in order to understand ancient polytheism, you have to premise what Kaufman calls a meta-divine realm. And Kaufman, with tremendous insight, and we probably couldn't have this insight apart from the path of deism, because we don't see these things until we see their opposite. He says, no, this is all built into the Hebrew conception. And that is why Genesis 1 is so very different from Egypt's Nut and Geb. And that two approaches to reality is the dividing line. And what I try to do with God number one and God number two is illuminate the dualism so that the coherence within the Hebrew conception of the God shows through. That probably didn't help you at all, Agent 69. Let me know if it did.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking like I was kind of almost coming around to like pantheism and deism. Like, would one kind of more look at God as the traditional kind of like, I don't know. Yeah, I kind of lost it.
No, but those are two words that you're barking up the right tree, because there's a deep similarity between pantheism and See, deism has to be post-Christian, because deism both has God number one and God number two, but they're not together. They're separate. So God number one in deism is the stuff God makes. God number two, so God number one is the clock, and God number two is the clockmaker in deism. But in deism, the clockmaker has gone away, and so we're just dealing with the clock. The Hebrew conception is so much more sophisticated, but again, as our resolution increased through studying philosophy, comparative religion, and all of this stuff, the more things we see, I think the harder it is for us to capture the whole picture as a gestalt. Okay? And but that's built into the theological assertions. And now I'm going to use mythological in terms of worldview picture, the mythological way in which the Bible communicates deeply to our elephant. And this is exactly why, see, another crisis we're dealing with right now is, does religious practice work? And as we're seeing now with the demonstrations, oh my goodness, religious practice is all over the place. They're all believing it's working. Well, yeah, bang, it does work. We just haven't known how does it work, and we're learning that right now. And so what we're learning is that if you want to sort of piece the universe together again between this dualism of God number one and God number two, probably the only way you're going to be able to do it is with ritual and all the stuff that we have identified with religiosity. But you might say, well, but you know, sitting down and taking a math course or getting a degree or being in training as an Olympic athlete, that has short-term outcome benefits that I can see. And what we're really dealing with religion are and if I get to do a video this afternoon, I'm going to do one about this. We get to see the power of principalities, which Paul talks about as being in the heavenlies. So yes, it has a lot, and pantheism is just in some ways an older attempt to put the clockmaker and the clock together. But you know, as I think James Cameron demonstrated in his movie Avatar, he couldn't unsee what deism saw. And so when at the climax of the movie, the pantheistic God takes sides, he blows the narrative. and suddenly he's an unwitting Christian again. And that's, you know, so Tom Holland's observation just rings through there, that as much as James Cameron is trying to get away from God number two, he simply can't do it, because you're going to be much more stuck with something I think you see more of in a certain degree of resignation that, well, we can't do anything. It's you know, it's so funny in Star Wars, no theologian would have written that thing, because the contradictions that are built in, we need to bring balance to the Force. Oh, I thought you wanted to eradicate the Sith. Why do you, I mean, if you want to bring balance to the Fourth, you call the Sith one political party, the red political party, and you call the Jedi the blue political party, and you try and keep it 50-50. Isn't that what balance means? See, and so Star Wars is, people recognize it as theological, but no theologian would respect it, because if you just listen to them talk, what balance? I thought you wanted to eliminate the Sith, and the Sith wants to eliminate the Jedi. This doesn't look like two sides looking for balance. So, and again, we get these worldviews get built into the world. And I think Peterson was really helpful in helping me see that. These worldviews get built into the world, and we can't escape them.
Thank you, Paul. The next question is from Shane the Holy Fool. I read several neo-reactionary writers, and they always hate Jesus. Any thoughts as to why?
Well, I would need to know what you mean by neo-reactionary, and maybe a writer or two that you're referring to. So I don't know if Shane's in the room.
Don't see him.
Okay. So
maybe
yeah,
we.
when I think about some neo-reactionaries in the Christian realm, I think of, let's say, someone like the Distributist, who's very Christian, and who had his own conversion experience that he talks about on some of his videos. So I think I suspect what's at the heart of a lot of atheism is exactly what Eric Weinstein expressed so vividly, in that once there's a God who can see you and know you and has an opinion about you, you're going to worry. But this is the ancient world. And so what do you do when you live in a context where there are forces greater than yourself? Well, what do human beings do? They create tribes and nations which surround principalities. And this is what my video this afternoon is going to be around. They make Voltron. They use the reality. Diversity and inequality are the same thing. Everybody's out there. We want diversity. Banish inequality. They're just as blind as Star Wars. We want to bring balance to the Fourth. Oh, I thought you wanted to get rid of the Sith. We want to banish inequality, but have diversity flourish. Well, diversity and inequality are almost two words about the same thing. So what human beings do when they create a principality, sort of like Voltron, is that they say, well, you look at the D&D roles of characters and say, well, you've got strength and you've got wisdom and you've got intelligence and you've got hardiness and you've got knowledge, and we're going to bring all of these people together into a corporation, into a principality, into a thing that is greater, a sum that is greater than a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, and we're going to fight the creatures that are coming out of the Pacific Rift. I mean, again, this is why Peugeot is so powerful, because Peugeot is using the symbolism and translating into English and saying, oh, this stuff isn't going away, and it's all over the place, and we do it all the time. So this is what human beings do. And this is why religions compete, because, well, to a certain degree, atheism and secularity are simply the recognition that Christianity won. And the tools that Christianity created in their wake are now being used to try to subvert and suppress confessional Christianity and older ancient tools. But what you see in the streets of America right now, with people bringing the tools back out, is just the recognition that Christianity won and the West is not going to give up on the tools that it created in order to do what humanity has always been trying to do, which can be seen in the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of the Tower of Babel. And that's why Jordan Peterson can walk in and say, oh, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Cain and Abel, Tower of Babylon. You want me to map that onto your world? Here, let me have a shot. I'll use psychology. Bang. He does it like a master. And millions of people watch.
Thank you. I think we had a question from Jess P. Last time. Jess, did you still have your question that you would like to ask?
There was a verbal question that was second when Agent 69 was asking about God 1 and God 2. Who was asking that?
Yeah, it was me. Sorry, I didn't mean to stumble over Agent. I was just wondering, you mentioned critical theory, and I had kind of been thinking about it since current events has brought it up. I was wondering, I know you've talked about it in some of your videos, but could you tell us your thoughts about critical theory, how it kind of is applying to events today, and what your reaction is to that?
Well, I've been learning about, all these like critical theory is a model that I didn't know much about. I didn't know about any of this stuff. I'm just a pastor with a church, and I was trained in theology. But I was watching, so I was reared in, let's call it second wave anti-racism. Okay. I was reared with Dr. King as my hero. And, what was happening in evangelicalism, the second wave progressive evangelicalism, where I was reared, is that, do we want to heal the sin of racism in America? Well, this is how we do it. We, Stan Vanderklay and Barb Vanderklay move into Paterson, New Jersey, and they don't live in the suburbs where all the other pastors from the churches that have moved out of Paterson are living. We live in the inner city, and we become friends with Black people, and we integrate into that neighborhood, and we become, in a sense, bridge people between white America and Black America. And in a very Christ-like fashion, we serve the African Americans who were leaving the Jim Crow South and finding work in the North, but who were struggling because of racism and all kinds of deep things and disadvantages that they were suffering from in a place like Paterson, New Jersey. And we do what we can to both help them survive their day-to-day needs, and we do what we can to help them begin to build wealth. And so we start Habitat for Humanity, and we start a Christian school, and we basically do all the kinds of things that second wave colonial Christendom helping does. And that's what I grew up in. Okay. And so it's only been the last few years that I'm, watching YouTube and reading things beyond just theology and history, which was most of which I would read, and the news, that I begin to understand, well, what are these third waves? So my mother was very much a second wave feminist, and my father was a second wave anti-racist, and I was raised in that. And suddenly the third wave comes along. And I think John McWhorter said it very well in his Atlantic article on third wave anti-racism, that it got very psychological. And so now this is starting to map on Barfield and the Protestant Reformation. And so, but I know that stuff too, because of course, my religious tradition is, I'm a 5-point Calvinist. This is total depravity. So I begin to watch all this talk about white privilege and owning your privilege, and I can recognize it right away. Oh, crap. Conservative, Reformed, Calvinist traditions have been owning our total depravity for a long time. And guess what? My total depravity includes my racism and my sexism and my homophobia and a combinatorial explosive blend of anything else I can arrive at in the world. And so I'm watching this, what we're calling critical theory now. I'm watching this manifest in my theological environment. And again, people are basically, we're all colonizers and colonizable. People are basically acting sort of like non-player characters. And I'm watching the patterns and I'm beginning to think, I've worked through a lot of these things theologically in a system that sort of maps onto this. And I think you have no room for atonement, or in fact, you have no room for redemption in this system because of its secular nature. And so I begin to see a bunch of these third waves as being products of secularity because they're limited by secularity. And the original shape of my religious tradition that had total depravity with redemption. Now, we were not perfectionists like certain holiness Wesleyan traditions that said, well, human beings are perfectible. No, we're an older tradition. We've got too much older stuff built into us, and we say, no, I will not be perfected before the grave. My racism will not be healed. and addressed and cleansed. My sexism will not be addressed. My homophobia will not be addressed. My sinful nature will not finally be resolved in this age. But I believe in an age to come. Now, what happens in a secular realm where any talk about the age to come is banished as heresy from the public square because of the shape of the American judicial legal system and the imagination that we can live within the scientific image, and that scientific image can be expanded out into every corner of humanity. Well, what we have now, which is, well, you've got to own your whiteness. That's the good news is you can sit here and be schooled in your whiteness by someone. The bad news is it's a terminal condition. But there's other little tricks that we're playing in this, that it's sort of like, if your terminal condition, if you know your terminal condition better than the other person knows their terminal condition, then you can have status over them. And if we use this status in a political, legal way, you can have power over them. And again, anybody who's following the strain can say quickly, oh, I get it. The first move I have to make is to acknowledge my sin. Once I acknowledge my sin, suddenly now I have status in the community. I've watched conservative Calvinists do this for years. And then once they have status in their community, they use the power of the community against the ones with low status. Now, again, someone who's looking at postmodernism will say, yeah, that's the whole game. But as always, we have difficulty seeing our own game, and you can say, okay, so the game of postmodernism undermines postmodernism itself. So then James Lindsay makes the observation, which to Benjamin Boyce, which when I heard it, just the light went on. Oh, of course. There's always one thing you can't deconstruct, because you can't see the world without having something to see it through. And there we're on to the frame problem. So what do you make your frame? Oppression. My oppression, my experience of oppression. It's sort of Descartes mapped onto this. What is the one thing I can't doubt? It's that I am oppressed because I have the feeling of oppression. That now becomes the frame through which to see the world. Now, so you've got that system. Now you say, okay, I'm going to use this system in the basic way that human beings have, the basic trick that human beings have used in order to dominate the planet. We're going to create a principality by which we can outcompete our rivals and competitors. Problem is, your oppression is individual. Well, with intersectionality, we're going to chop it up. Yeah, but you're just adding combinatorial explosion and an awareness of combinatorial explosion with intersectionality, and you're back down to the individual. The strength of the individual is its particularity. The weakness of the individual is its resistance to being fully integrated into a hierarchical principality through which human beings have always conquered the planet. So when people are freaking out about critical theory, I'm thinking, yeah, I understand that. A lot of people could die and suffer a lot because of critical theory, because it has no power to finally enable that trick that human beings have always done, which is to cohere as a group. Okay, so we're going to be right now in this moment, and Mary Cohen hit it exactly, in that icon of the reality of racism in America, in that image which cohered that all, right now we're going to be all against racism. So then racism, anti-racism becomes the idol around which we can cohere. And people, powerful and non-powerful, up and down, corporations are putting out the sacred words, okay? But how long is this going to last? Well, until a gay person gets oppressed by a straight person, or a man is hurt by a woman, or America is threatened by China, or see, the problem with critical theory is it will always be unstable. Well, so then we're going to map it to oppressed and oppression, but the credential of oppressed and oppression is my individual experience. And once I am oppressed, so then right away on Twitter, I saw where one person from the cast of, I don't know if it was High School Musical or was it? One white woman from the cast of High School Musical said that the Black actress made her life a living hell. Well, there's her oppression. Well, see, you're not, and a lot of people have noticed this too. Once you engage in creating principalities around race, well, you're just going to trigger more racism. And Glenn Lowry, in video after video, has been saying, because we racialize, not to say that race isn't there, but because we see this one incident through this lens, and because we are applying all of these other lenses, at some point in America, especially, everyone's saying, well, white's now a plurality, not a majority. That's just going to make it all the more dangerous. Because once white people decide they're going to play this game too, and enough of them do, then minorities of every respect are once again going to be some pretty awful victims. And that's why Glenn Lowry, Jordan Peterson, and many others are saying this is not a good game to play, because the people who you're trying to help, their children and grandchildren are going to be the victims of the game you're playing right here and right now. And yeah, I think they have a real point. So on one hand, I think it's easy to overplay the threat of critical theory. I think it has a fatal flaw, which will always make it a parasitic, reactive dynamic. But that doesn't mean it can't kill a lot of people and cause a lot of misery along the way. It just simply can't finally stand. And so why, go back to Jordan Peterson, Biblical Series 1, why is God outside the system? Go back to my conversation with Brett Sockold. Why is God outside the system? Because once you put God inside the system, your system will break down. In other words, and this is Peugeot's point, it has to lay out in these ways, and things repeat according to predictable cycles, because reality has a structure. This gets into Carl's repeated notion about natural law. Natural law is sort of a secularish attempt. It's a deistic attempt to, again, we're afraid of the idea that the universe itself has designs and will finally enforce itself. You can kind of talk about that deistically with God, with natural law, but it's sort of a weakened secularish version of it. Finally, full-blown, stable Christianity, well, God is outside the system. In him we live and move and have our being. It's God number one and God number two. And critical theory is always going to be a bit player, because it can't finally cohere into a coherent principality around something like oppression because of combinatorial explosion and relevance realization. It simply breaks down.
So, Paul, I just have a question about that quickly. Do you think that Nazism is also critical race theory?
They have something in common. So Nazism is basically social Darwinism. I mean, it's what it is, and it's nakedly so. And see, I couldn't figure out, so Darwinists, with their ideas of evolution, said something like, well, people came from monkeys. I mean, it's very low resolution when you think about it. People came from monkeys. So here's chimps and apes. And guess what? They've got black fur. And, oh, look at what's over in the neighborhood of chimps and apes. Human beings with black skin. Oh, there must be this real nice linear line of human evolution that we started in Africa and we lost hair and we got whiter and so then you have, and you can find these things still in books and museums. You know, they sort of got shamed out of the culture by the Nazis just following through. So, well, quite obviously, blonde. Well, why is blonde more evolved than black hair? Well, because monkeys have black hair and blonde people have blonde hair. Oh, so blonde people, light-skinned, are more evolved and therefore more intelligent. They are the superior race. It's very low resolution. It's very easy to see. Okay? Now they fancied it up and, you know, but that's basically the outline. And I always wondered, why are the Jews? I mean, because I would understand their system if they'd say Africans, okay? Because it fits their model. Well, what's with the Jews? Why the Jews? And that's when reading Timothy Snyder and this other author, I can't remember his name right now. You go back to my videos where I talked about the Nazis. The Nazis were far more sophisticated, and they're German. Germany was the most developed, most religious, most powerful country in the world in many respects. They also had a land problem, which they wanted to resolve. So they look at what's with the Jews? Well, they're reading Nietzsche, and what does Nietzsche say? Oh, Christianity. Christianity is a system, a systemic imaginary that affords power to evolutionary and biological losers. And that's the source of trouble in the world. So if you want to set the world right, human beings need to stop setting up systemic imaginaries that allow unevolved creatures to have power over more evolved creatures. So, we're gonna, and so if you read Timothy Snyder, they had all kinds of ideas about, well, maybe there could be a Jewish homeland on Madagascar. You can send them to Madagascar. Kind of like the British did with Australia. So, but again, I thought, why the Jews? Well, it's because the Jews started this. Well, when did the Jews start this? In the Bible. And so with Hitler's first attempt at gaining power, he was unsophisticated and anti-Christian. Well, Germany had really high rates of people who were Christians and going to church. And so what Hitler had to do was sort of figure out how to smuggle these ideas in while he needed to stand in front of a church and hold a Bible. Okay? And he needed to somehow make this a biblical thing. And a lot of people bought it. Well, they bought it because human beings see opportunities and threats. And so you can manipulate Christian populations very easily. It's not hard. But certain people began to see through this and began to say, hey, this is not Christian at all. And in fact, what he is trying to do is destroy Christianity. And now, fast forward to Ross Douthat's observation in one of the videos that I played. I think it was at the American Enterprise Institute. So Nazism was in many ways the logical evolution of one particular pole, which is social Darwinism. And the Soviets are in some ways the exact opposite. And the Nazis hated communism because they were their polar opposite in some ways. And Karl Marx founded it, yada, yada, yada. And so what Timothy Snyder nicely demonstrates in Black Earth is that, poor Eastern Europe, you had people who were all about the imaginary on one hand with the communists, and you had people who were all about the social Darwinism on the other hand who wanted to destroy the imaginary because that was the source of all our problems. So the communists would take over Belarus and Poland and try to set up their utopian structural imaginaries, while then the Nazis would come through and conquer and tear them all down, because you had to get rid of the state, because the state is sort of the quintessential social cultural imaginary principality. You had to get rid of the state in order to let nature have its course. And that meant getting rid of the Jews and anything that had Jewishness about it, which would be thinking and philosophy and psychology and books and all of that stuff. But of course, they had a deep problem, like many do, was that their tools were all built on that stuff. And so, well, they kick out all of their scientists, many of whom are Jewish, which go to the West. And, well, yeah. So this gets into Adam Friended's supposition that the culture with the best religion wins. So.
All right. So next we'll read a question by Andrew Tinsley. Watched your video from a few days ago on progressive and evangelical. What do you think distinguishes the doubling down on modernism that you describe from a more helpful approach Christians can take on responding to questions from skeptics? Is it mostly a matter of appealing to the elephant as well as the rider? It seems like the church fathers were often engaged in various forms of debate with people outside the church. So I'm not sure that all apologetics is a modernist practice.
No, that's very right. Apologetics is not a modernist practice. It's the form. Now, let's give modernism its due. N.T. Wright, in one of his videos, says, I want a modernist dentist. I don't want an ancient dentist. Just Google how many teeth. Google Aristotle and teeth. You get some funny answers. Because thought men and women had different numbers of teeth. To us, that's preposterous. But, ancients were thinking in ways we never thought. But anyway, so no, apologetics being, let's say, be ready to give an account for the hope that you have, in terms of, this passage from First Peter. Anyway. Basically like I said, a long time ago, not a very long time ago, a couple hundred years ago, as this scientific way of thinking was demonstrated to be enormously powerful. And it is. People began saying, oh, how can we apply this way of thinking to the Bible? Suddenly we have systematic theology. Suddenly we have grammatical, historical exegesis. We have these incredibly powerful tools that I use in my ministry. We have all this amazingly powerful stuff. Well, we as human beings are consummate overreachers. If you look at what's happening right now politically in the United States, we have two parties. They both have their turn overreaching, and they do it again and again. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we don't know we're overreaching until we do often. And again, the kinds of systems are so subtle that they're only played out over massive numbers of years and massive numbers of people. And that's how they get instantiated. Now, modernism is an astounding, powerful tool that we are not going to get rid of. But what modernists struggle with is to realize that it is only a tool. And it is a wonderful tool of getting at certain kinds of truth in certain ways. But it is too small of a tool to get at all of the truth. And what happens is that modernists reach their limits. Now, a certain way, okay, so we're in this world and we're trying to have all of our stories match each other. One certain way of dealing with that is to use these modernist tools to try to match our stories. All right, that's very powerful. It's very helpful. But we really only see our stories worked out again over hundreds of years and millions of people. That's the frame of reference. Statistics was a really powerful tool that sort of tries to help us with that kind of scope. But none of us are a statistic, and all of us act as individuals, as individual agents. And so things break down. And so most of the modernist thinking systems tend to be foundationalists. So here's a constant bone of contention between Esther and I. I was raised in the school of Dutch Calvinism that became quite that grew out of that grew Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Waltersdorf. In my 5th year at Calvin College, because I didn't start Greek early enough, I had a chance to take a course on epistemology with Nick Waltersdorf. And he basically went through all these ideas about foundationalism. The modernist approach to knowledge basically tries to assume a monarchical vision by which we can ground all sorts of things and create systems of logical inference, stacking fact upon fact in order to have certainty. Now, we can do a lot of those kinds of things, and they do very well, but they don't necessarily scale up or scale down that well to human beings and how we believe. If you listen to someone like William Lane Craig, he has lots of arguments, and that's very powerful. And some people who are culturally very bent and temperamentally very bent towards that really find that sort of thing persuasive. Other people don't. What has been happening is that, you read modern apologists like Lee Strobel, Josh McDowell, I think that's his name. Evidence, reason, all this kind of stuff. It's very compelling, and it can be especially useful for debunking modernist arguments against it. But simply pointing progressive evangelicals back to modernist arguments are sort of like pointing Sam Harris to the Bible. He sees it in a certain way, and he's not going to unsee it that way. And so progressive evangelicals are being persuaded and wooed by other things. And what is the tell and the evidence of that is that the progressive evangelicals become more spiritual and more pantheistic. They devolve back into what C.S. Lewis calls the most human of our religions, the default thing that we fall back into, which is pantheism, and then, pretty quickly they'll be like Verizon Lisa talking to the universe about her needing a smartphone and doesn't her hair look nice today? That's where it goes. So doubling down on modernism will not address the progressive evangelicals, even though some of the tools of modernism, you see me using them. They're very, very helpful and very, very powerful. It's just modernism is framed within much bigger things. And Jordan Peterson was able to show those bigger things.
Can I have a follow-up question to that, Paul?
Sure.
I'm wondering whether you think the sort of modernist apologist way of getting people into Christianity as a form of evangelism is sort of kind of on the way out, or whether it's having a resurgence, or whether you think it has any kind of a bright future in the sort of post-Christian, postmodern world.
The effectiveness of these tools in populations are directly related to the broader cultural plausibility structures that they are built upon. So as modernism continues to wane as a broader plausibility structure, people who major in modernist apologetics will find smaller and smaller populations impacted. Now, what I think we tend to see as humanity goes through time is that through this constant process of overreaching and underachieving, we learn some more things. And so modernist dentistry is not going away. And some of what modernist apologetics and modernist philosophy are really good at are going to endure. And there will continue to be populations that modernist apologetics continue to be effective with in terms of persuading people to participate in overt Christian practices and articulate Christian beliefs. So it's not going away, but it sort of gets subsumed into the broader stream that is going down the river. And because modern dentistry is a lot better than dentistry 300 years ago, and modern medicine within its domain continues to be very powerful and effective, it's not going away. It will continue to have power. But we just keep forgetting that it's human beings that wield it. And the downside of modernity seems to be if you look in the modernist mirror too long, you're going to have one heck of a meaning crisis, because you're going to think it's just group A all the way down, and the whole show is one long mechanistic determined thing, and your child is just a more developed rat, and you drown rats. So yeah, and I think we've seen this stuff played out, and we can learn it. But we have the difficulty of consciousness, which is at one hand an immensely powerful tool because it can focus. But again, as with just about everything else, its strength is its weakness. And so we can tend to only speak one thing at a time, appreciate one thing at a time, and parallel type thinking and powers is exactly why we employ principalities in order to do bigger things.
Maybe we could take a question from the listeners. Does anyone have a question for Paul?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go for it.
Oh, okay. So off that last question, talking about apologetics and kind of the shrinking number of people that will affect, I've kind of gone through a long process of being kind of a pure materialist, and now kind of back trying to figure out if I'm going to go kind of the religion with no religion route, or some kind of Christianity route. And I guess my question is, like, how, as a Christian yourself, Paul, like, you just see witnessing to people like on an individual basis, like modeling one person at a time? Because the people in my life who have deconstructed out of Christianity and now are agnostic or atheists are just I mean, I was having trouble understanding your Rhett and Link videos, but they're right there, and you know, it's like there's nothing that's going to interest them because of those like foundational assumptions. And so I guess I'm interested in learning more about like the foundational assumptions that lead people to that point. And so I think I need to do more work on your God 1 and God 2 thing, but if you could kind of respond to that. Sorry, it wasn't very coherent.
Well, you know, a lot of sociologists have been linking this stuff. Read Christian Smith on moralistic therapeutic deism. Read Robert Bella on Sheilaism. There's a real question as to how pictures and sound on screens have been forming us. That's a deeply complex phenomenon. I remember hearing one thing, and I can't quote it because I don't remember exactly where I heard it, but someone basically said, a lot of these stories that we watch on Netflix and TV and even read in novels, then now pay attention that they're in story form. a lot of these stories, what they really do are shape our expectations and assumptions. And so I very much understand why people deconstruct, because I'm immersed in the same river they are. And I feel those currents and those powers and those forces. And this is part of the reason why the gay and lesbian question has been so powerful with deconstruction, because there seems to be a certain obviousness about, well, at least, again, now we're not seeing backgrounds here. You have this lovely gay or lesbian couple down the road that are like you in almost every way, except they're same-sex attracted. And so they have, in a sense, mirrored Christian marriage as it's come through America, and they're acting in all the same ways, and people look at them and say, gosh, you know, when we listen to all the stories, and again, they're stories, when we listen to all the stories of all the horrible ways in which gay people were persecuted in the past, well, what's the reason for, you know, saying that? And again, you might not be doing anything to these people, but what's the reason for not wanting to make them a wedding cake? Notice how it's all often these symbolic things. What's the reason for that? Well, and this is where the modernism starts to hurt. Well, it's in my book. There's a rule in my book. Oh. And, well, following rules are a very powerful thing. And for a long time, churches have been using this methodology. Well, here's the way the system works. Rule keepers please God and go to heaven when they die. Rule breakers offend God and go to hell and are punished when they die. Can you find that in the Bible? Yes. But if that was the only thing in the Bible, you'd have a point. But that's one image, and that's one narrative in the Bible amongst a whole bunch of others. And just like, here's another thing that preachers have been saying, you can't pick and choose. You have to take the whole thing together. Well, now when that sort of gets mapped onto rules, you get kind of a Kathy Keller thing. And when she talks about women in office, is say, oh, but the people who are saying women can be ministers are picking and choosing. Well, yeah. And the other people say, yeah, but you're picking and choosing too, because you're eating shrimp and you're condemning gays. And so at this point, you have to begin to say, we need to take a lot longer, slower look at what's going on here. And it's going to get very, very scary, because it's not just going to ask, what are all the representations in the Bible about same-sex attraction? It's not only going to ask, what are all the ideas in the Bible about human sexuality? It's also going to have to ask, what on earth is this Bible and how is it supposed to function in life? Well, in the Protestant Reformation, they had to deal with questions that deep, and so they wrote confessions. Well, we're going to have to write confessions too. And what happens so often for people who are deconstructing, and, you know, it sounds like a cheap shot to say, well, you move to Hollywood. Yeah, it's kind of a cheap shot, but it's also a factor. And when Tony Campolo says to his son, Bart, well, you deconstructed because you stopped going to church. And Bart can rightly say, well, I stopped going to church because I was deconstructing. Yeah, it's both and. But now, could it be that if I weren't a pastor who didn't have 5 children, who was deeply formed by hundreds of years of family life to, in my value hierarchy, to have divorce and abandonment of children, and to have those be really horrible things, maybe if I was a cop or an accountant or something like that, I would have deconstructed years ago. But I'm kind of, well, gosh, my livelihood and my pastoring is kind of put together. So yeah, all those bulverisms are active, I'm sure. But it also forced me to, deconstruction isn't going to come too easy for me. And so maybe I better start reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, because I find in C.S. Lewis, Here's a guy who understands the meaning crisis. Here's a guy who understands mythology. Here's a guy who's far better read than I am. Here's a guy who, worked a lot of this stuff out in his life. He's a weird dude in a lot of ways. Couldn't even drive a car. He's an oddball in so many ways, but I don't want to deconstruct. And this is something you hear almost always from people who are deconstructing. They don't want to do this because they see the loss. They loved living in a world of a God of love who, when any bad thing happened, you could say, you know what? That was really horrible, and I don't understand any kind of justification for that. But Jesus is Lord, and my God reigns, and I'm going to trust him, and I'm going to go into this hard place even with that belief. And guess what happens? If you're equipped with that and you really believe it, and you're only going to really believe it if you've practiced it and been in discipline, community about this, when you go into suffering, yeah, you suffer and it hurts like hell. But you know what else? It's also producing massive amounts of meaning in you. And that meaning is, and it's all the Jordan Peterson stuff, that meaning is powerful. And you can shoulder suffering, and you can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and you can walk through the flood and the fire, and you can be tortured, and everything can be taken away from you because of this vision, because of this story. And we don't even, look at all the movies we watch. They're all like that. Why? Because when we watch the movie, we participate in it. And we feel it. And so, yeah, and that's why, but we're not masters of ourselves. And that's why, that's why I'm on one hand very patient with people who are in the throes of this because, well, it's a function of where they're living and what they're doing. But I'm also, and it sounds crazy to them, well, if you want to stay in church, stay in church. It sounds like the simplest, most obvious thing in the world, but it's true. It's like dieting. You want to lose weight? Eat right, eat less, exercise. Well, but the problem is I can't. Yeah, I get that. So what are you going to have to do in order to be able to do it? Well, a bunch of like maybe go to church, be in relationship with Christians, read certain authors, watch certain movies. And someone will say, well, you only are a Christian because you want to be. I find myself believing nothing. Oh, so non-agency is at the top of your hierarchy. Okay. Congratulations. But as C.S. Lewis noted time and time again, you have to stick to it. And non-agency is really hard to stick with. And, I think certain forms of certain religions really strive in non-agency. Yeah. I can't imagine going to church every Sunday. I don't know. How many hours do you have to meditate? Depends what you want.
Yeah, no, thanks for that response. I'm so obsessed with like meaning and grace that I feel like it's pulling me back, and I have more or less stayed in my church because I love the people there so much, even though like oftentimes I don't believe any of the things that they do and the way that they think and stuff. But that was a really helpful response. Thank you.
Cool. I have another written question that has a follow-up question to it. So first I'll ask the original question, and then and then I'll ask you the follow-up question when you're ready for it.
Okay.
All right. This one is from Eric M. Hamilton. In regards to the religious nature of the protests in your Should Police Kneel video, you bring up the fact that white guilt has many of these activists that many of these activists advocate. If you really pin them down on an answer as to how much it would take to cover the cost, they would say an infinite amount. If we have a religious movement that is forming, and many in the church are part of it, that is advocating infinite guilt without the possibility of payment in full, how should Christians respond to this rising religious sentiment, since it seems to be in direct competition with the notion that Jesus paid it all?
I think Eric, as a as a author and as a preacher, knows exactly what tree he's barking up. You know, Christianity portrays itself with an inevitability to it. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Philippians 2. Well, that's a big promise. Well, if you begin looking at these dynamics and you recognize that in many ways, critical theory, third wave anti-racism, all of this stuff is born out of Christianity. Well, it's not surprising that, you know, and again, I didn't see that dynamic until I was making the video, because I mean, I remember Jordan Peterson in the monk debate asking, okay, what tell me exactly, put it in dollar amounts, how much it will cost to relieve white America of its original sin. Even once you start using that language, you're just you should see the futility of the project, because yeah, an infinite amount. Well, how could anyone pay an infinite amount? And again, just read the Heidelberg Catechism. This stuff has all been worked out theologically before. It's just the people aren't mapping the language between them. And so, or maybe I'm projecting it on. Well, maybe, but it's very interesting the way that these things keep coming up. Now, I think part of what Eric is asking is tactic. Whereas I think, so what I've seen from James, from James Lindsay in the Church of Atheism, their church has been split between atheism plus and old style modernist atheism, which is James and Peter Boghossian and many of them. And they want to argue against using rationalist tools against critical theory. And I think they're quite effective. And a lot of what they're doing has been very helpful to me. And I appreciate their work. Christians have almost exactly the same thing going on. And again, you'll see that modernist Christians, as they deconstruct, become progressive evangelicals, also become woke. They slip into third wave feminism, third wave anti-racism, third wave gay liberation. You know, it's following the track. Tim Keller, if you look at Tim Keller's model for evangelism in New York, it's almost exactly opposite that of someone like a modern apologist. A modern apologist basically comes at the world with right and wrong frames
of the church by establishing his own state-based welfare system in the hopes that people would turn their affections away from the church and towards his new pagan state. So this collective concern for mercy and compassion really was a novel thing that was introduced to human consciousness through Christianity, along with romantic storytelling. So it should tell us something about what is a key ingredient in a good story, which is that it should arouse our sense of compassion. Because compassion doesn't come easily to us. For example, you could hear about some tragedy on the news and maybe acknowledge it as a tragedy, but not be personally and emotionally affected by it. Simply knowing about someone else's adversity usually isn't enough to provoke our empathy. In order to really care about someone else's story, you have to spend time getting to know them and their situation. And through that personal investment, you may
Then now you're struggling with your mic. Anyway, I was gonna mention that what Tim Keller did was, I think that might have been an accident. It was fairly on roll. Someone want to mute him? There, I did. Anyway, Tim Keller, modernists would tend to say, "We're right, you're wrong." Tim Keller comes around and says, "Hey, you know what? I see where you want to go. And I don't think the tools you're using to get there are really going to get you there. Let me show you a better way to get there." That's Tim Keller's evangelistic strategy. And that can very much be employed. And you'll hear me doing or trying to do similar things with, it's not that third wave anti-racism doesn't want a good thing. They want a very good thing. They want us not to be racist anymore. The problem they have is their tools are finally and fundamentally oppressive, which is what the modernists are seeing, and which will finally defeat this, the critical theory,
actual compassion,
the parallel critical theory agendas, which can never finally cohere.
It means that they're
so. Tim Keller comes along and says, you know, we have a lot of agreement as to what the world should be like. So I have bad news and good news. The bad news is we're not.
And a follow-up question. Sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. There we go. Follow-up question is,
well, Valerie,
yes.
Could I add something, just ask something, I guess, in addition to that, because I guess, part of my question is also that I've noticed a lot of people, very church and actually surprisingly sometimes very conservative church people start to adopt a lot of this critical race theory language in the last week or so, and it's been very confusing to me. I think maybe in part, maybe they don't know where a lot of this critical race theory language is coming from, and they just like you said, it sounds right, and like you said, the end goal is laudable, to end racism, right? Who can be against that? But it seems like in adopting the language of critical race theory, they don't necessarily see the contradiction or the possible contradiction in what they are saying and what they are affirming. Does that make sense?
We lost Paul for a moment.
Yeah, it looks like it.
So we want to pause the recording for the moment until Paul comes back.
No way. This is the fun part.
Okay.
Let the voices ring out. Let's have some irreverence while.
Let's go, Mike.
Moses is up on the mountain, right? Who's got the golden calf?
Me.
On that,
my golden calf.
Whether this third wave is trying to do something good by ending racism. I think one problem is that they're changing the definition of racism. Let's end racism. I'd be all on board. But my vision of that is that we no longer discuss race and simply say, this person isn't being treated properly. Whereas it seems the goal for some people currently saying they want to end racism is that every person starts by stating their race, and then we're all supposed to treat them differently according to that. Does anyone else see that problem, that it's, if they're going to change racism to only because they're in power and all white people are racist, that to my ears growing up, like with the second wave anti-racism and all the Nazi punks fuck off stuff, was we were supposed to stop talking about race. Does anyone else see it that way, or am I missing the mark here?
No, yeah, Mercury, I think that's who was talking. I was going to say, in regards to that, though, and I think this is how it kind of piggybacks onto what I originally wrote, is that to simply just not or pretend that racism is gone or to treat everybody equally doesn't address past past wrongs that need to be paid for. And so I think that that's where the third wave is trying to address that, is that there needs to be reparations or something that because just to say, well, from this point on, we're going to act as if, you know, there's no such thing as race, is in itself, I guess they would argue, is in itself a racist act, because some people are already better off than others at this 0 point. And
I'm not
because of the past.
My thinking wasn't that there's no such thing as race, just that it's not predominantly important. Unless wrong, and I'm also isn't racism. The racism by second wave definition, I believe, is still there and needs to be rooted out. And you know, maybe this comes from white privilege, but even when it comes to the thought of, but shouldn't we make reparations for past injustices? I think the post-racist way to do that is to take care of everyone who's not doing well, regardless of why. So that it's not a matter of your skin color or what was done to your forefathers at all, because some people are in a hard place now and none of their ancestors were. Some people are doing very well now, even though their ancestors suffered. And I think it would be more productive just to focus on who needs help and to stop worrying about why. And just to look at what kind of help do they need. So for instance, if there's a Black community with poor schooling, abusive racist police, I don't even need to hear history. I just have to see the current situation and say, yes, the local police should be treating them like any other person. And yes, we need to improve schooling for anyone, regardless of how they got to this point. Does that come across to anyone's ear like I'm being racist?
When I was in school from 2015 to 2008, the predominant attitude was, if you don't admit your original sin of racism, that is evidence of your racism, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's very unhealthy. Like it doesn't even matter if it's true. In a way, the way they're going after it is just not useful. That's what I have to say on it.
So we have Paul back. Eric,
Now,
would you? I'm sorry.
I lost my internet connection, so I tethered my phone and hooked up a laptop. Looks like the internet connection is back. Where did I drop off?
Eric was just.
I had a follow-up question or a follow-up thing to your answer that
Did you hear what I just said about Tim Keller?
What was that?
Far? Did I get as far as Tim Keller?
I think so.
Yeah, you did.
Okay. Give me a second. I'm going
Sure.
to switch back to the other computer now because the internet connection is back in the building, and so I'm going to get off tethering. So I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. So when we come back, we'll go back to you, Eric, and you can go ahead and ask your thoughts.
He's gonna make an okay boomer joke.
Sorry, I didn't mean to keep or hog all the time to myself.
I agree, though, that the level of analysis that we keep giving the current situation that we're in is we stop at race. And we say, because race X, and it's not helpful. Got to have the
We go.
conversation.
We have Paul back.
So you got to follow up?
Yeah.
Eric?
So in regards to like what you were asking, and I'm gonna see if I can try to recapture my thought from a few minutes ago, is my original question that I was asking about the dynamic between this critical race theory, woke religion, or religious movement kind of thing that I've seen in like the last week or so, a lot of religious friends, and sometimes surprisingly conservative religious friends, adopt the language of critical race theory in what like almost appear to be these kind of confessional like statements on Facebook and Twitter about how they're complicit in whiteness and white guilt or these various things. And it's surprising to me, and I guess I'm trying to figure out what is the response to that when this critical race theory seems to be in direct competition with Christianity in regards to how to pay for guilt.
I think in many, it's all stupid human tricks. It's not all stupid human tricks, but it's, often, especially right now, a direct assault is pointless because it's not there. Ask questions, because what happens is this is how religion works. It's how religion's always worked. People are taking on these ideas. They don't know what they're taking them on. They're not thinking them through. They're simply taking it on, and they're taking it on because they get to participate in a principality. They get to, they can feel, okay, I feel guilty. I mean, just look at the suffering of this community. What can I do? I feel guilty about that suffering. Well, in a strange way, admitting your guilt helps the guilty feeling. I mean, again, any Christian should know this. So now they're taking on these words, and it's exactly what I do with, the regular Christianity, that historic Christianity that you'll see in a church. Well, Pastor, I want to be more spiritual. Okay, what do you mean by spiritual? It's anti-racism. Tell me about anti-racism. Just ask questions. And for many, many people, if you ask them, Black Lives Matter. Okay, do you mean the slogan, which is, well, to me, for a Christian, it's a tautology. Of course, Black Lives Matter. Yes, Black Lives Matter. I have no problem saying Black Lives Matter. How about the organization? Well, see, now this is where experience counts, because I've got a fair amount of experience and ties to people who are connected to NAACP, Black political leaders, so on and so forth. They won't say much of anything in public, but Black Lives Matter as an organization, well, there's a whole nother conversation. So, but all of this is it was so funny because Al Sharpton was expressing so much optimism because all these young white people were with him. And I thought, yeah, I don't know if that's a gift that's going to keep on giving there, Al. Because most of these people, what are they doing and why are they coming to it? And again, it's not unlike you put up a new church and they've got the best band and everybody's coming there and they say that everything the preacher says is great and they're all giving money and everything's wonderful. It's like, yeah, I've seen that show. But what happens when the next thing comes to town? And this, again, because of the structure of these competing narratives within critical race theory, this is going to last until a man beats up a woman. Now it's going to be Me Too. And then suddenly, all the black leaders are like, well, wait a minute. I mean, the Democrats in their campaign on when they had everybody on the stage, can we all agree that the environment is a priority? Who's willing to say that? Nobody's against that environment is a priority. Well, are you willing to say that on your first day in office, you will do X? Well, what's the priority? Is it the environment? Is it race? Is it protecting women? You know, the funny thing, again, if you know some history and can keep some things in mind back when, like during the Kavanaugh hearing, I believe her. Oh, okay. Women should be believed. Okay. They shouldn't have to justify their claim. Okay. Emmett Till. They're a woman, made a claim against a man, and, well, we're not going to wait for courts or anything right now. We're going to demand that everyone declare that Emmett Till, that this woman who had this claim against Emmett Till, that her justice cannot wait. No justice, no peace. So they lynched him. Well, so is it women? Or is it race? Or is it environment? Or is it economy? Or is it COVID? Well, okay, now you've got competing things. How do you manage that? A hierarchy. And the hierarchy is flexible with respect to time. So, yeah, everybody's on the internet. Why? Because, number one, unless you're doing it, people are going to look at you suspect. Well, this is why Jews got persecuted forever. It's all the same thing. Can't we learn?
Paul, what happens when asking questions starts to be this sign of like bigotry and racism? Because this is what I started to see as well, that if you have to ask that question, that implicitly shows that you're racist, that implicitly shows this, that, or the other. How do we handle that?
Or that you're ignorant. And
right.
Fortunately, in our culture, we have a degree of, if you take the humble position, if you apologize and say, excuse me, if you own your ignorance, you can ask a question from ignorance. When I was a day camp counselor in Northside and Patterson, and I would go to the urinal, all the little black boys would kind of come around to see, because they wanted to know if I was white all over. And that was a part of what my white they didn't see. Now we allow this in children because we know they don't know. Well, none of us, all of us here know what it's like to be us. None of us knows what it's like to be someone else. And the degree to differences, you know, when black folks say, you white folks don't know what it's like to be black, you say, amen. I don't. Tell me. But then when they say, I'm tired of telling white folks what it's like to be black, okay, then stop. But that means that some white folks aren't going to be able to know this. And that also means some white folks are going to speak out of their ignorance. And all of those dynamics are with us all the time. I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be Hispanic. I don't know what it's like to be a Dutch immigrant. But there are closer and further ranges of this. So if we adopt a posture where we say, please tell me, and keep asking questions. And that's, in my opinion, one of the most productive ways to deal with people. And that's, so when you see me doing conversations with, I regularly people get upset with me when I post conversations with people that they disagree with because I haven't challenged X. Well, there's some really problematic aspects to call out culture, because call out culture has a certain amount of hubris implicit within it. It's important, can be done. There's a place for it, but that's all what wisdom is about.
Cool. Maybe we could have a question from a listener. Does anybody have a thought or a question for Paul?
I have a question. I feel like so much of this particular issue, the ways we've changed the definition of racism, or maybe we've conflated it, because I feel like I grew up with the colorblind definition of addressing racism, what our position should be towards race. And I see so much of the current movement and the story that's being told as much of it is a rejection of that MLK colorblind vision. But I believe that so much of it is a conflation between that colorblind vision of racism and the disparate outcomes you get with how racism can affect the system. So racism now becomes systemic racism, and you just fold the adjective into the noun, and it becomes the new definition. And I'm trying to, I appreciate that there's a lot of, maybe you could say there's a lot of white people who are realizing that there are blind spots to the colorblind narrative, where there are aspects of system that produce disparate outcomes for many different reasons. There's so many variables at play. It's really hard to nail it down to just one being racism. But I'm getting kind of irked by a lot of the ways that people with a colorblind vision of racism, who are being awakened to these systemic issues, and we're seeing so much of it in the church, and especially my evangelical friends, like everybody's just all of a sudden super woke this week, and there's this aspect to it that really maps on to the public prayer problem. I keep seeing there's so much of the morality that's performative, especially through the screen. How do we come to a realization of the ways in which the systemic problems can produce disparate outcomes, but we don't have to fall into this like mimetic religious public ritual thing where you have one race bowing before another to try to symbolize this ritual, and try to symbolize like coming out of ignorance. And I see so much of performativity in what's happening. How do we try to breach the gap in a more careful way without everybody getting so anxiety ridden? Because that's the other thing I'm seeing with all my evangelical friends. Like I even came home and my wife was doing research all day on systemic racism and just watching all the videos. And since we have the videos, it's just tripping everybody's amygdalas. And so everybody's getting really worked up. And we're seeing this kind of like hive mind happening. And she like worked herself into a panic attack. And all of the moral pressures are to just dig into that amygdala response, because that shows your righteousness, that shows that you've been awokened. How can we not look reactive or reactionary against some people realizing the disparate outcomes, but still try to maintain a more careful and nuanced approach to talking about race?
Well, let's look at a couple of basic things. Number one, consciousness and our experience of consciousness sort of means one thing at a time. Okay? Number two, every time we ask a how can I question, we are on an ambitious striving for greater power. Right now,
that's good.
Via social media, we have more and more power. So we got that. And we're feeling that. We're like, wow, how can we, so okay, so let's say you're a Black American who is really tired of, I have some good friends who the story is true. I've never been pulled over on Florin Road once, and my friend who lives down the road from me, he's more wealthy than I am. He's works in public service. He's got a law degree. He gets pulled over regularly, and it's like, it's just not fair. And he gets pulled over because he's black, and I don't get pulled over because I'm white. And it should stop. And he's exactly right. It should stop. This has been true for a very long time, my entire life. And my entire life I have lived in one degree of community with I've been a minority in most of the communities I've lived in my entire life. But the complexity of those dynamics is nearly infinite. Again, combinatorial explosion. It's nearly infinite. Okay. How can we do better? Okay. We can do things one at a time. The more earnest we get and the more developed we get, the more power we have, which means we not only have tools that can be useful, but also misused and potentially greater unintentional consequences. Third, we have time. And what does that mean? That, okay, I'm watching this video and I've seen this black man get choked to death by a white cop on video. The cop didn't seem to seemed to be enjoying it. This just triggers in me all kinds of things. All right. What am I going to do about it? What are you going to do about it when? Well, now suddenly we have social media. I'm going to go on Facebook and I'm going to change my avatar and I'm going to copy and paste a video that's, I thought was really fine. Good. How many people are going to watch it? Well, it depends how many followers you have. Good. What are you going to do about it? A lot of nothing, probably. And this is where all of the pathos that is stirred up right now is probably setting a lot of people up for really big frustration because, well, just wait. Wait for the next time that some woman is propositioned by some man and pressured by her job to give in to him. Didn't we learn anything the last time we had Me Too all over the place? Didn't we learn anything the last time a black man was killed by a white cop? Didn't we learn anything? Okay, you're imagining a model of learning that is popular but fictitious. We don't learn by, you know what, Homer? Mixing vodka and mayonnaise might seem fun for now, but you're going to feel like crap tomorrow. Well, that's the problem for tomorrow's Homer. We don't learn this way. Well, how do we learn? Well, this is where I get back to a lot of what I learned from second wave anti-racism. Well, why don't you build community with people different from yourself? Yeah, but I'm really busy. Yeah, okay. So you're probably going to have to make some intentional changes in your life. And it's probably going to cost you money. And what I dare bet you will find if you do this is that you'll see that slogans are slogans. And that, well, I put myself under the authority of people of color. Great. People of color, that's what? I don't know. 7/8 of the world population? Which person of color? So you build a life where you integrate the values that you have. Now, you're going to have to establish a hierarchy of values. What do you put on top? I'd recommend putting something on top that's outside the system, can't be corrupted by the system. Well, how on earth do you do that? Because everything around me is in the system. You're probably going to need a religious framework which already has baked into it years and centuries and generations of human wisdom. And you might alter it and adapt it. And so in 1960, Stan Vanderklay went to Paterson, New Jersey, and he knew nothing about Black folks or Black culture. But he came there as a humble person to learn. And over the years, he learned in high resolution a lot about racism, but What he learned about racism did not destroy what he also knew about human beings, which, by virtue of what we know about racism, is more important often than just the racial layer of connection. That you're going to find people of every color who have strengths and weaknesses, biases and problems, and they're all through a stream in history. And so you build a life that integrates these kinds of things, and hopefully in a proper way. And, well, how do you begin? Well, if you say, my life is all about anti-racism, okay, what about the women? What about the gays? What about the poor? What does it mean to be poor? Because poor is a very broad term. What about the oppressed? What about the white kid who grew up in a black neighborhood and got beat up a lot? Is he not oppressed? You probably got you've probably got the ingredients for a white supremacist. You know, it just goes on and on and on and on. So just be wise about it.
So we're almost to 1 o'clock. Whatever. We're almost up to 2 hours now. We could do one more question, or we could call it as it is right now. What would you prefer, Paul?
Let's see if we can get through the questions that people wrote down. We have a lot. Oh no, we got a lot of those. So
we got a lot of questions.
We can't do that either. Oh crap! All right, let's take one or two more written questions, and we'll just leave this room here, and we can figure out what to do next time. And it's my fault. My answers are too long, and they're so ranty. So I feel like Jonathan Peugeot.
You have lots of good things to say. Okay, so the next question is from Julian. Paul, what do you think characterizes the kind of Christianity that is exemplified by the conversations happening in this little corner of the internet? Peugeot commented that he thinks that there's a split between those who really believe and those who don't, and that this is forming a sort of cross-denominational, I don't know that word.
Ecumenism.
Thank you. In these circles. I do notice that a lot of the Christians who stick around in our circles do have small or orthodox credentials, but not all, I think. But it doesn't seem to be the distinguishing feature that makes this community special or real alternative to the modernist apologetics, liberal Christian culture warrior faction. What do you think is the characteristic feature is? Also, do you think our tribe is a minority group or the future of the church?
Ooh.
That's a long one.
Yeah, in some ways, well, that's Julian. And in some ways, he's asking the essence of this group. And that's always a fun thought experiment. We'll never quite answer it definitively, probably. There is a degree of small o orthodox credentials. I think part of what it takes, this gets into the deconstruction thing. I think there is a discipline that you learn by maintaining a commitment to an outdated religion. And you learn habits of dealing with dissonance in certain ways. And so I think so right now what's happening, and here's the thing, now is now, and now is powerful. We always live in the now. And right now, because people live on TV, on social media, the events surrounding George Floyd are dominating their salience hierarchies. Well, here's the thing about being old. You've had a lot of now. And if you've had any ability to self-transcend and you see yourself at different nows, at some point you ask, I want to be a thing that transcends these nows and yet keeps narrative and thread continuity. All right? So if you're in the practice of maintaining in your life at a deep level continuity with small or orthodox credentials, that gives you a certain capacity to manage all of the nows. It gives you a certain perspective. It affords a variety of things. Special, a real, and part of what has created this community is all of you, for whatever reason, are finding I'm helping you in some way with something. And so we're all sort of on some same page, even if we can't describe it. And we're probably working on different things. Other factions have other things that they're working on together. I think we have a desire to both process and transcend many of the common elements that we're dealing with. I mean, Jordan Peterson triggered a lot of this stuff. I saw Jordan, and so my people are just powerful collectives in and of themselves. And Jordan Peterson is a powerful collective. And again, it was really Jonathan Peugeot that helped me see this, how I am many down within me, striving to be a coherent whole. We are many among us, striving to be a coherent whole. All of that is built into Christianity. Becoming one in Christ. Jesus asks in the Gospel of John for this. Do you think our tribe is a minority group? It's obviously a minority group. There's billions of people in the church, and there's only 1,000 on this Discord. Is it the future of the church? I think what we are doing now participates in a long thread of similar things that have happened in the church. I suspect that what we are learning here, if we can practice it in our lives, will grow. But as is almost always the case. So when that cop was doing that to George Floyd, I don't even remember the cop's name. When that cop was doing that to George Floyd, he was participating in something. And now he was participating in a lot of different somethings. When people see that iconic photograph that Mary Cohen correctly identified its iconic value, when people see that iconic photograph, they are reminded of a lot of what they have participated in. And because we are all participating, I mean, here's the crazy thing. We watch these movies where people are wasted and killed all the time for no good reason. But all of that gets filtered through a value system, okay? And that value system, as Jordan Peterson tried to show Sam Harris, is constructed over very long periods of time and integrates huge disparate aspects and qualities. So what we're doing here, I think at a fairly high level, is participating in that process. And I think one of the things that I would dare bet, if a sociologist came into our little community, they would find some ways in which our little corner of the internet is different from the imagined general population. All of us have internet connections. I think probably this group skews higher in general intelligence. I think this group skews higher in openness. I think this group skews lower in agreeableness. So here we can use that metric to kind of look at us. So that's part of what we're doing here, but that doesn't scale. And that's why being a pastor is really helpful, because my church skews too. I began to notice that, why was it when I came to this church that certain kinds of Black folks kept joining? And those Black folks had a lot of similarity to me. Well, why would that be? Well, it has a lot to do with where I grew up. and who my father was, and the ministries that I've always participated in, and the language that I've always used. Now, in the middle of all of these racial tensions, when I talk to the elders and deacons in my church, I find they don't see many of these issues a lot differently than I do. For years, people would, and they continue to be on my channel, be bothered by the fact that I voted twice for Barack Obama. How could you do that? Because of abortion, value hierarchies, decision matrices. Would I have preferred Barack Obama to be in favor of restricting abortion more? Yes. But in terms of my mappings, and I would try to explain to people, I vote like a black person. Well, why? Because of when and where I grew up. So Julian, I think we're going to continue to be a minority, but a happy one and a productive one. And and that's okay. There's my answer. Well, it's 12:07, and let's see, all these names. Agent 69, were you able to record this thing? It's probably good if he didn't, because then I don't have to.
No, I wasn't able to record it. I think someone else was recording it, weren't they?
Yeah, we're still going.
Oh, okay. We don't have a recording of it, so I'm just gonna drop it here at 2 hours because I have some other things I need to do, and this has to fit into my value hierarchy. And I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. We're just kind of making this up as we go along, and I thank you for your questions and thank you for coming. I don't know. A bunch of you are still here, so I guess it was worthwhile. I hope I didn't ramble too much, but
it was good. It was good. Good food for thought. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay. So everyone, thank you for coming, and I plan on doing this again next Friday. So we'll see how this thing works as we do it. So thank you all for your good questions and for coming. And again, part of the reason I'm a Christian is I believe in the age to come, we will have way more time for this than we have it now. What makes the Apostle Paul believable, in your opinion? Fun. I mean, that's why we do this, because this is fun, and I appreciate you people, and I appreciate everybody who's made this happen. So
yeah, it is fun. Paul, if you're looking for feedback, we can do a real quick check. Like, if everyone can get to the voice chat text, convo recording chat, or questions. Let's do questions for PVK, and just type a 1. Type a 1 if this chat was useful to you, right? If what Paul said was useful and you found it interesting and it maybe was insightful, go ahead and throw a 1 in chat. And this is maybe the equivalent of applause for you.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful. That's helpful. And we're learning how to do this. Luke 0.1. Oh, that Luke. What are we gonna do with Luke? Maybe. Yeah. So anyway. Thank you all, and part of me knows whether or not it's helpful if you keep coming. So, and maybe, and again, we'll try to continue to perfect the ways that Discord can work for us. I prefer this to what I saw Jordan and Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke doing with question and answers on YouTube live stream. I think that's a fine way to do it, but gathering questions, this seems to work pretty well. Maybe I don't know. We have a problem of scale here, and I know, Dr. Jim says, are you fetishizing small? Well, maybe, but if there's only 20 or 30 people here, it's pretty easy. And if there's 500 people here, it's not as easy. So 30 is good. So we happy 30. So anyway, thank you all. I can ramble forever. It's a flaw, but I'm going to sign out now and get some of my other work done. So Have a great day.
Bye, Paul.
Bye,
Thanks,
Paul.
Paul.
Thank you.
Well, thanks.
Is there a way that we can possibly